Hello and welcome to the Chris and Bud Show. My name is Chris Scarborough, and with me is my co-host, my friend, and my brother in pod, Mr. Bud Bohannon. Together we'll be taking you on a nostalgic ride discussing a wide array of topics from our childhood through today, hoping to share a bunch of laughs along the way.
Yeah. You know what time it is. It's time.
No, not yet.
Can I go now?
Yeah, now.
It's time for the Chris and Bud Show.
Hello, welcome back. My name is Chris,
And I'm Bud.
and today we're going to be talking about what is classified as Generation 5, which is the PlayStation, or at least for us anyway, it's the PlayStation and N64. Obviously, there's other consoles included in this, like the Sega Saturn and a few others that had some commercial success. But seeing as we didn't play those consoles, we really just wanted to focus on the two that we did, that being the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. We're going to start today talking about the PlayStation. It was released September 9th, 1995, at a cost of $299. If you adjust that for inflation around today, it'd be about $506.
That's a lot.
Which, yeah, it's amazing. Just kind of talk about PlayStation in general before we get into some of the games. It's amazing some of the things that they introduced in 95. You know, they switched to the CD-ROM. They redesigned a controller that they basically still use today. I mean, this controller came out in 95, and that controller's, I mean, there's some tweaks to it, but it's basically the exact same controller that the PlayStation 5 has. You know what I'm saying? There's not a lot of differences in terms of
don't fix
overall. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's amazing. And that we talked off air kind of like about the Sega Saturn and how it failed more so, if anything, above, obviously some video game support and from your publishers and things like that. But that controller design, it didn't evolve. We'll talk about the N64 controller as well, and it was something totally different. It was like it looked almost like a in terms of
alien
video
creature.
yeah, an alien compared to everything else going on. So PlayStation definitely helped usher in this new world of video games for a lot of kids, video game consoles in general. They marked the sign of the times. We're moving to CD-ROM. We're moving to a more in-depth and hands-oriented controller where you're actually kind of like, you have buttons to press and things that kind of can have other functions than a basic three-button controller. I think that as a whole, I mean, that's why it was so successful. It just, after you get past that initial jump of like, wow, this is so different. It's one of those things, especially in, where we live in America, and we both live in North Carolina right now. And you throw too many new things at people and they're like, screw that. And I think that's what PlayStation was worried about, at least in the beginning. But it's amazing, obviously it held up. It did really well. But it's one of those things that it had so many differences, especially for a 95. Like, I guess you forget to some extent how long ago that the original PlayStation was released. You almost think about it as like it was released in the late 90s. I guess in my brain, everything happened in the late 90s, early 2000s still. But it's kind of one of those things that's kind of crazy. If you want to go ahead and start going over some of those top 10s, we'll see some of the games and talk about some of those in depth.
Yeah, for sure. But the cool thing about the PlayStation versus the Nintendo, they were heading more towards the realistic side, whereas 64 was still doing their standard Nintendo Mario style games. But PlayStation, like you said, was moving more towards realism. They were giving more options for older people to play video games that weren't so cartoony and childish. Yeah, I'll just run through quickly. I got a list pulled up of the top 10 selling games for PlayStation. Number 1, we have Gran Turismo, the first one. Number 2, we have Final Fantasy VII. Number 3, Gran Turismo 2. Number 4, Final Fantasy VIII. 5 was Tekken 3. 6 was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. 7 was Tomb Raider, first one. 8 was Crash Bandicoot, the first one. 9 was Tomb Raider 2. And then 10 was Metal Gear Solid. So, out of that list, I've played probably 4 out of the 10 games on that list. How about yourself?
I'm probably slightly lower than that. The original PlayStation wasn't really on my list, or wasn't something I had in my life early. It was definitely a little bit later. And so I remember a couple. Just kind of go through at least one or two that I remembered. Like Crash Bandicoot, I think was definitely aimed at my age group. It was released in '96. So, I mean, what was I? It was not quite. We're like 8 or 9. So probably I was probably 10 when I got it. It was one of the things where it's like still aimed at what we were looking for. But the game that probably redefined PlayStation or defined PlayStation and defined that era was obviously Tomb Raider. That game did I remember being a kid and some of my cousins who were like, late teenagers and their girlfriends were playing. And, I always thought I was unique or weird that I was playing video games. They used to always say that to me. You know what I'm saying? Like, that was one of those things like, oh, you're playing them damn things,
Yeah, back
Why
before
aren't you
gamers were accepted.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where it's like, but Tomb Raider changed that a little bit. Like like I said, like one of my cousins, he's about 10 years older than me, give or take. So if I was about 8, 9, he's a teenager. He's 18, 19 years old, a grown man, and him and his girlfriend. I remember them both specifically playing Tomb Raider 1 and 2, and it's just amazing when you think about it. Like that time period, had it been 5 years earlier, I was made fun of for playing video games, other than certain games like some sports games or things like that. But if it came to like any sort of RPGs, I definitely was getting made fun of. So it's like one of those things where I never really got into them, probably for that pressure, unfortunately, for having so much family. And my family was the youngest of the family that was around. So it was me, my brother, eventually my sister. And then it was like everybody else was so much older than us. So it was always getting made fun of for all kinds of things. It's just the way family is, but definitely video games. So I didn't get a chance to play a lot of these other ones. I'm sure I played Gran Turismo some. I was kind of surprised to see that it was the #1 selling video game. And I'm sure people are going to be like, of course it was. But in my mind, it was like, I guess it's mass appeal throughout, not just America. We're talking about in terms of the worldwide sales. So it may have done well other places, more so maybe than America. It just kind of surprised me, I guess. What about you?
Yeah, for me, I'd probably say my favorite game on PlayStation was Metal Gear Solid, and then followed by the Spyro games. Like you, whenever the PlayStation come out, that's what caught my eye, was more so those adventure games, especially like the open world style adventure games. Just a couple on my list that I have was like Spyro, Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, Rayman, Spider-Man, Bugs Life, those kind of style games that they didn't really offer many of those from the previous generation, which I think is why they were my biggest played hits. I played some sport games as well. Like, I'm not even a big sports fan, but I played the hell out of Madden 2000. For whatever reason, I just played that game a lot. A couple racing games like Gran Turismo, but at that time, it wasn't really my style game because it was a realistic based driving game. And I like more the Need for Speed style game, the arcade simulation style. There's the other games too, like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, still kind of categorized in that sports style game. At that time, I think I was probably going through my punk rock kid skateboarding phase anyway, so that might have helped transition me in there.
I think we all were, weren't we?
Yeah. And then Twisted Metal 3. That game speaks for itself. SmackDown, Parappa the Rapper, which was, the Guitar Hero pretty much of its time.
Yep. Yeah, I think as a kid, because of course we're talking, I mentioned this in the first episode, I mentioned this in basically every episode. It was me and my brother, and I basically say that every single time we talk about video games. So I had to play games that we could play together, that we could, sort of flip flop or switch off games. So that's why Crash Bandicoot was one of them. But Tony Hawk Pro Skater, I know that everybody says that Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 was the best game that they ever released. But in my mind, when I was a kid, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, the original one, I played that game so much. It was something that me and my brother could play together. Had split screen. It's one of those things where you could just enjoy the game. And it was kind of crazy because, you didn't know any of these people. I mean, Tony Hawk, but you didn't know any of the other players or any of the other skaters. It was one of those things where you were just starting to kind of move into that sort of realm. At least I was anyway. I mean, it was released in 99-ish. So it's one of those things where it's like, as a kid, 99, I was in 4th grade. So I wasn't quite there yet, but I was getting there. When I hit middle school, I started to skateboard a lot. I had my uncle build me some jumps and like some ramps and things like that. So it's one of those things where it's like that. This started that though. This helped me into that kind of down that path. I mean, it had killer music. Like, I think that's
Yeah.
That's one of the craziest things. Like we always talk about it. It had such good music, and it's like things I never listened. Like if you had said, Chris, have you ever listened to any? There was probably a song or two, but for the most part, I wasn't really into punk rock or ska music or that sort of stuff. Hadn't had any. I mean, we're in elementary school. Basically, your whole thing, you're just listening to whatever your dad listens to or whatever's on the radio and that sort of stuff. You didn't really experiment much yet. At least I didn't. It's one of those things where I got the opportunity to sort of hear some different stuff. And I know my dad used to give me goofy looks because he's like, what is that crap? Just it's kind of the way that it was back then. But it definitely redefined me as a person in terms of like what my next 5 years was going to be. Which is kind of amazing. And like you said, Twisted Metal. Cool thing about that game was it had gore and like craziness without having gore and craziness. Like, I mean, it was one of those things where it was like, it didn't dehumanize anybody. I guess there was people always riding or driving, but like you didn't really, I guess, at least as a kid, I didn't, because I guess that's one of the big issues now. But then it was like you were just blowing up cars that were driven by other people playing video games, in your mind at least. And that was another game where we could play split screen, and me and my brother could both play. And it had a killer soundtrack too, like a killer soundtrack. And I think that was when I first heard Rob Zombie. I think he was in that, and or maybe it was White Zombie, or what was it called? What was the other band called he was in? Did I say that right?
Yeah, you're right. White Zombie was his first one.
Okay. I just want to make sure I don't want to sound like an idiot, but yeah, I can't remember which one. It was either his band as Rob Zombie or White Zombie. I can't remember which one, but I do recall that. There was another game I played very similar to Twisted Metal, was Vigilante 8, and it was like set in the 70s. So you had a lot, I'm pretty sure it was set in the 70s, and it was kind of like old school style, but it was played the exact same way. It was one of those where as a kid, you got to, parents would let you go buy games, but it had to be like from like the Platinum Selection or what do they call them? Whatever they called the ones for the X or for the PlayStation, like their Gold series or whatever. When they were re-released cheaper, and we got to buy those. That was because we were never allowed to buy brand new games. So it's one of those things where you had to buy used games or games that were at least cheaper. And that was one of those games, and it was a lot of fun. Like I said, it was basically exactly the same as Twisted Metal. It was just a slightly different in terms. Obviously, it couldn't be a direct import, but it was very, very similar. You got any other games you want to talk about?
Just to hit up a little bit about Twisted Metal 3, that soundtrack. The 3 songs that you heard on that was Super Beast, which is still a good song to this day. More Human Than Human and Meet the Creeper. So when you load in that game and Super Beast starts ripping, that's a pretty good song to get you going. You know what I mean?
Yep.
As far as some other games, Spider-Man. I mean, I've always loved Spider-Man growing up. I don't know why. I hate spiders. Terrified of them. But I love Spider-Man. And that game was so fun, swinging through the city. Even to this day, I still play every Spider-Man game that comes out. And the first Spider-Man game is the one that started that for me. And I think I liked it because it made up its own storyline. Like it was still tied to the comics, but it didn't follow any kind of like story arc from the comics. It was just its own entity.
Right.
Another game that I played the shit out of was Big Ol' Bass 2. And I know that's going to sound weird because it's a fishing game. There was this monster fish that you could catch in every lake, and I spent hours grinding to get this behemoth.
That's so funny.
Yeah. Metal Gear Solid, obviously, that game's so good just because of the story behind it. It was probably one of the first games I played that had that massive story. I'm sure for most people that was probably Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII. Because those games, if you didn't get behind the story, they weren't really good games as far as the way that they played. Metal Gear was also a fun gameplay game because it was, you had like Tomb Raider and stuff like that where you just run through and you kill stuff. Metal Gear was more directed to being a stealth-based game. If you got discovered, you could kill, but it would be so much easier on yourself if you just sneak through.
Right, yeah, I didn't spend much time on that one. I think that other than the only other game that I really played a lot on, obviously I played the Madden games. As a kid, I was definitely a sports fan. I still am, but I was definitely a sports fan as a kid, where a lot of my games ended up being, because again, we could play 2 players, that sort of stuff. It was like the Madden games. And, I got into like the franchise and building your teams and that sort of stuff. And that's when I started to fall in love with certain teams and things like that. So that's when in that time period, that stuff was still going for me. But Rayman, I got it for Christmas one year. I didn't know what to do with it. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't know what this is, because as a kid, you have to have something that's attached, right? You had to have a thought process. Like, you weren't usually, we were, unfortunately or fortunately, we were strictly based on advertising, like how you could push it towards me. Unless a friend told me, "Hey, Chris, you should look at this game," or somebody, somebody had to tell me about it. I wasn't really, I was too busy at the time being a kid. We had to go outside and play. We weren't allowed to, sit inside all day. So it was one of those things where we were forced to go, and we had to go to the park or ride our bikes around, whatever. We had to go outside. So we didn't have a lot of time spending playing video games. So I didn't get to get as many, as much variety. Especially, there's no way I would have ever made it through a Final Fantasy game as an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old. I wouldn't have done. I wouldn't have gotten very far before I had to go on. As my mom used to always tell me, just go on, get out of here.
Yeah. I didn't have that luxury because I kind of lived, off the beaten path. And
Right.
my mom, she was very protective of me growing up. So a lot of things that most kids would deem as normal, I couldn't do because my mom, she's just like every other parent, people our age nowadays, you kind of think with that protective mindset, and especially the way the world is today, how we view it today is how parents viewed it, 30 years ago. That's never going to change. You know what I mean? So for me, video games were a good source to keep me, entertained, because my mom kind of looked at it like, he's home, he's just playing games, he can't get into too much trouble by doing this. And she
Right.
never cared what kind of games I played. Like, she wasn't like super protective where I couldn't be playing, Resident Evil because it had blood in it, or decapitation, that kind of stuff. She didn't care about that. Once again, I didn't live in a neighborhood, so I couldn't just, walk down the street, go next door and go play with the neighborhood kids, and go ride bikes and stuff like that. I rode bikes by myself where I live, but that gets really boring when you're by yourself. So video games for me was always that escape to not really talking to people, with the exception of, my mom, dad, and sister.
Yeah, thinking back on it, it's amazing as a kid obviously they don't want us inside playing video games. It's amazing the sort of the crap and the stuff we did as kids, because they tell us to go outside and play. And granted, I lived in a neighborhood. There was a park, I don't know, quarter of a mile from the house. It wasn't very far, and you never hit a main street. It was all in that neighborhood. So it wasn't like you were out there like for you. You live right off of a main road, so it's like 55 through there, 45, 55. It was nothing like that. We're in a neighborhood where it's like 25, 35, that sort of stuff. So we're never really in any sort of danger in terms of that. But yeah, when you think about it, people are so weird and worried about their kids these days. And I don't say weird in a bad way, just very protective. And we were just kind of like roaming the neighborhood. Like, they used to have streetlights. So it's like, yeah, you just got to be back when the streetlights come on. And that's when it starts to get dark. And it's just kind of crazy. I guess, obviously it was a different time, so you kind of get away with that stuff in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I'm sure my mom worried about us a lot, but I guess it helped that it was me and my brother and my sister later on. It was like we were always together, so it's like, I don't know anybody who's going to try to steal all three of us. You know what I'm saying? Like, we were a handful as it was. I don't know if they wanted to take all three of us, So we got to, I guess, this is one of the things to think back on that. It's kind of amazing, like you say, where you don't have that option. Unfortunately, we were stuck in a situation where we did, and we just didn't have very many opportunities to play video games until probably early 2000s. Well, once my mom once they bought a house and we was kind of on our own. When I was a kid, we was living with my aunt, so we was kind of like, we were kind of all shacked up in a house, so we didn't have as much freedom as a kid, as a young kid. Once my mom bought a house in 2000, my mom and dad bought a house in 2000. We were kind of like on our own. Things changed a little bit. We still had to go outside and play, but it wasn't as strict, I guess. But yeah, you got any final thoughts about the PlayStation before we move on?
Some of the things too that I wanted to hit on was the fact that the PlayStation was the first console where you could play music CDs. So at that time I was listening to Ozzy Osbourne, Iron Maiden, Korn, Rob Zombie, thanks to Twisted Metal, and I'd just plop the music CD in the PlayStation and play it, because it had that little visualizer thing on it, which I thought was pretty cool. Also, I want to touch on the accessories for PlayStation, and I've got 3 here that I used to use. The first one was called the multi-tap, which looked like a boomerang, and it allowed you to plug in 4 controllers into the console. because the PlayStation only had two controller plug-in ports, so that Boomerang allowed you to plug in four controllers and four memory cards. The other thing too that they made was a LCD screen for the smaller PlayStation that came out. I don't remember exactly what year that one launched. It was a couple years after the big box came out, but it plugged into the back of the PlayStation, and it was pretty much like it almost made it mobile. I mean, it wasn't mobile because you still had to have a wall outlet, for power, but it definitely helped, like, say, if you didn't have a TV to play on. So I thought that was pretty cool, especially way back then.
So just to clarify for you, it was the PS1 when it was redesigned in 2000. So just to throw that out there. It's amazing how long those lasted as well. When you think about it, the PlayStation, we're talking about, they redesigned it in 2000. 2000. I'm pretty sure the PlayStation 2 was already out by that point, or was coming out very soon. It's isn't that kind of wild to think that they not only continued to support for it, but they redesigned it and try to make it more profitable in 2000, 5 years after the original console was released. Actually, yes, the PlayStation 2 was released, right before the PlayStation 2 was released in North America. It was released in October of 2000, and this was released in July of 2000. So a few months before the PlayStation 2 was released, they re-released the PlayStation in a smaller, more compact, white version. Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and move on to Nintendo then, unless you have anything else you want to add about the PlayStation.
Nah, that about all summed it up for me. We'll have a bulk of the conversation on Nintendo, I'm sure.
Don't hit the pause button. We're still rolling. But it's time for some questions. All right. It's that time again. It's that question time. All right, bud. What did you want to be when you were small?
Well, for starters, I was never small. I was always been a chunky boy until I grew up, and then I lost weight. But what did I want to be when I was young is how I'll take your question. And the answer to that would be a rock star. I mean, who doesn't, right? You get to go and play music all day. You get to go tour around different cities, see the sights, groupies, maybe do a little bit of drugging. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff out there I've never experienced. I could be the next Nikki Sixx. I could be the next Celine Dion. Who knows? How about you?
I was a very eclectic kid. I don't really know what I wanted to be when I was small or a young boy. I definitely had my time where I wanted to be a rock star. I know this is kind of like avoiding the question, but yeah, I had a lot of different ones I wanted to be. I wanted to be a rock star lawyer, a rock star, and I wanted to be a professional football player. None of those things came true, but I had my thoughts.
And that ends question time. Now let's get back to the show.
Of course, yeah. So the Nintendo 64, man, I tell you, it was released June 23rd, 1996 in America. All these times that were released are based on that. Cost was about $200, and adjusted for inflation, it was $329. So to put that in perspective, it was released a year after, basically a year after the PlayStation. It was almost $100 less. And I think that probably helped its success. I mean, that was kind of Nintendo's thing anyway. That was one of those things they still today, we talked about how they were kind of like blocky and more cartoony, and it's basically the exact, that's what people buy Nintendo for, more or less at this point, you're right? Like they buy it for the exclusive titles and the blockiness. That's been their calling card forever.
But you got to think too that Nintendo still had the success of the NES, the SNES. PlayStation's just this wild card company that comes out of the gates like, hey, we make a console too, and it's $100 more than the competitor. Buy ours. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. So I mean that made a huge. That was huge for them because like I said, like you said, they had the opportunity to be like they had that equity built up where they already was like, hey, we're Nintendo, buy us. PlayStation, I think they struggled at first, but yeah, it's amazing that they ended up. Obviously, it was the best selling console in that generation by a huge margin. I don't have the list right here with me, but I do want to kind of go over one of the cool things about the Nintendo 64 is they made it in so many different colors and styles. I think that alone was one of the cool. I mean, obviously the basic gray controller with the black console is what most people remember or charcoal console, however you want to describe that, was what most people remembered. But I remember specifically getting a red controller, and I was like, this is my controller. Like,
Yeah.
John, you can play whatever the hell controller you want, but this one's mine. Don't touch it. Mine is the red one. You play whatever you want with this one. And it's like, just that alone, like that gave you something. And of course, all these now, you can make your own controller with whatever you want on it these days. But in 96, 97, 98, this time period, it gave you some, what's the word I'm looking for? It gave you the ability to have some customization and have some, freedom to kind of express yourself a little bit. Because, if you go to a friend's house, it has 4 ports. You might bring your controller with you. And you might go to a friend's house to play Nintendo and look at my cool ass red controller with you and your basic ass, gray controller. What you doing?
Yeah. Check out my Pikachu controller, son.
Exactly. It's one of those things where it just, I think that obviously Nintendo probably aimed itself more towards kids, that they more or less still kind of do. Obviously they have some games that aren't, but for the most part, that's just kind of been their calling card. And a lot of those kids grew up and they still play to this day, but it's one of those things where it's like, they did a great job of allowing you to play at home, like as a group, as a friend, invite friends over and play video games. We don't really do that these days, You just, hey, let's jump on Xbox. Hey, let's jump on this. Let's do whatever. You just play over the internet these days. Back then you didn't have a choice. And that was one of the cool things, and maybe that was why PlayStation added the what did you call it? But where you can play with 4 players, because this came out and they're like, crap, they have 4 ports on it. I feel like it definitely had some cool things. The controller, for example, that thing was like we already talked about. It's kind of like an alien. It was very unusual.
Yeah,
it never really fit in your hand properly, but at least they tried something. Like we can, I mentioned earlier talking about Sega Saturn and how I felt like they didn't give enough opportunity, or they didn't do anything to really change that controller. It looked just like a Genesis controller, just with extra buttons on it. At least Nintendo attempted something, and they made use of it. That's the other thing, with that extra handle and the analog stick there. They still made use of it, where there were certain games, specifically Mario Party, I remember, you had no choice, but you had to use that, Like I probably broke, I don't know, hundreds of those damn analog control sticks playing Mario Party. What are your initial thoughts, at least, on the Nintendo 64? We jump into the games.
Well, for me, the 64 is one console that holds a special place for me because my grandpa bought the console for me, and I'll never forget it. It was Christmas of 1996 is when I got it, and I really, really wanted it because I had went to Toys R Us with my grandma, and they had it set up on a demo, and they had Mario 64 set up with the demo. And I used to go into Toys R Us. Me and my grandma would go quite often to go and look at new video games and stuff like that. And every time we'd go to Toys R Us, I would stay there and play that thing, which felt like for hours. It was probably only like 10 or 15 minutes because I'm a kid, but it felt like hours. And I really, really wanted this console, and mainly that game, Mario. So Christmas rolls around. I'm opening up all the Christmas presents and stuff like that. I didn't get a 64. It was maybe like 5 minutes later when we were done opening up presents and stuff. My mom's like, hey, you got another one behind the tree here from Santa. They duped me. And I'll never
forget.
Straight out
of a Christmas Story.
Yeah, I'll never forget opening that box, man. I ripped that paper up and I seen it. I seen where it said Nintendo, and I was just so filled with joy. Like that was a memory that I'll hold with me till I die. That was just one of my most remembered Christmases of all time. Like you said, the controller was very weird. I still don't even know if I know how to hold it correctly till this day, because I think they really wanted you to hold it through that little middle holster and use your thumb kind of. Yeah. Because most games didn't utilize the D-pad on 64.
Right. Which is why it was weird, because you're like, I don't know, you feel like you're missing something when you're holding the joystick and not the D-pad,
The yellow C buttons, those were pretty much used for camera manipulation in most games. And it was awful.
Yeah.
PlayStation had the joystick to where you could rotate the camera smoothly. 64, the camera manipulation, it snapped in like quadrants, especially like in Mario. Like y'all that have played Mario, you understand the camera's just awful.
Mm-hmm.
In most games on 64, it's awful. But as a kid, you're not thinking about things like that. You're just like, I got my man's Mario. We gonna go save this bitch Peach because she got her dumbass kidnapped again. We gonna go do this.
Yeah, that's what Well, the cool thing about it in Mario, I think they're one of those buttons you automatically snap back behind you. So that was the only thing that really,
it recentered the camera.
Right. So that was like the saving grace for Mario 64 for sure, was you could always recenter the camera right back behind you. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and list off like the top 10, if you got it available, if not, I can go ahead and list them off, and then we can kind of talk about those.
Yeah, the top 10. I'll just go ahead and preface this. I've played every single game in the top 10 list, and I agree with the top 10 list. It's pretty good. So at number 1, we got Super Mario 64. No surprise. We got Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye 007, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, probably my second favorite game ever, Super Smash Brothers, Pokemon Stadium, Donkey Kong 64, Diddy Kong Racing, Star Fox 64, and number 10 is Banjo-Kazooie.
Man, what a list, right?
It's
like
a powerhouse, man.
That like pulls all my heartstrings as a kid. Obviously, I didn't play every game that's on that list, at least at the time as a kid. Basically, that is about as good of a top 10 as you're going to get from. I mean, obviously, at this time period, especially, most of those games are like untouchable. Like just thinking back at it, right? Like in terms of like all the time you spent playing these games, and you're like, man, I just remember so much about it. I mean, well, obviously, you got to start with number 1, right? Super Mario 64. That was the first game where I was like, I got really into I need to get everything and do everything. I think it had 64 stars, right? That was kind of one of the thought processes behind the game.
It was 120.
Oh, 120. Okay. My goal was to get every one of them. I was like, I want all of them. And I think that was the first game where I was like all about trying to get where completion mattered. Not necessarily finish, but the completion mattered.
The other thing too, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the other thing too about that game was when you saved it, it gave you a percentage bar. So that kind of aided your drive to complete the game. You know, if you saved it, it's like you're only at 20% and you're close to the end of the game. It's like, oh, well, how do I get to 100?
Yep. Yeah, I think it was like one of the first. I wasn't the first 3D. I don't think it was the first 3D one, but it was one of the first ones, and they did a great job with it. Like you said, the camera was a little goofy, but that was just N64 in general, just because they didn't have the analog sticks to kind of, like you said, make it more fluid and easier to use. But I felt that it was such a huge leap from my last played Mario game, right? Because obviously you played Mario RPG and a couple of those other Mario games that maybe came out later on the SNES. But for me, the last game I remember is Super Mario World. Maybe Mario World 2. I can't remember Super Mario World 2, but it's one of those things where it's like, I don't remember a whole lot. So you're talking about early 90s, and then you're moving on into like late 90s, early 2000s, and it's like, this is completely different than what I remember. They introduced a lot of cool things where you can wall jump and you can do backflips and sort of stuff like that. I enjoyed that it was all kind of set in one area, and you just had to go, and you walked into the doors to enter the levels. I thought that was a nice little touch that they added in the game. They did some cool things just with like new characters. Like I remember the what are they called? Like the little spiders that walked on the water. Like that little touch, and like certain other things that they added to the game that kind of like really accentuated what Mario does well.
Yeah, like when you burned your butt on the lava.
Right, yeah. Like, yeah. Just certain things they did that just kind of like really pushed Mario to the next level.
Oh, and that was another thing too. They gave Mario an actual health bar. It wasn't just you smack one enemy and die. You had an actual health bar, that little radar.
Yeah, didn't it, was it the one that like once you got lower to level, the one that like pulse? Did it do that in this one?
Yeah.
Or am I mistaken?
It would have that constant sound effect too that would like kind of be like, Dano, Dano, Dano.
Yeah, I wish I had played this recently. I probably haven't played this game since I was like 15 years old, if that. But yeah, if you want to, kind of go over a little bit maybe of your experiences with Mario 64.
Yeah, it was pretty much the same as yours. It was one of those first games that I wanted to 100%. Like I said, playing it in Toys R Us just really captivated me, and it was just one of them games I just played for so long, trying to get everything, because all stages had 6 stars out of that stage, but you didn't have to get all 6 to progress the game. But I wanted to get all 6. And even as a kid, getting the red coins, that was always a star for all the stages. So I wanted to get all the coins regardless. Fighting Bowser, to me, was fun, because back in the old Mario games, all you had to do was bonk him on the head with your butt. Super Mario 64, utilize that, where you could grab his tail and swing him around, which is a hard concept to wrap my head around when I was a kid, because I used to, I wasn't very good at angles. I wasn't no professional billiards player. So trying to get him ramped up full speed and let him go at the right time to throw him into the little bomb, that was hard when I was a kid. But yeah, that's about it as far as Super Mario. And then, man, like Mario Kart, like what an amazing racing game. So much better than the Super Nintendo variant.
Yeah, I didn't play. I played it some. I didn't play it as much. Like that wasn't. That was probably one of those games I rented. Racing games were not really on. I still played it a lot. Don't get me wrong, but it wasn't really on my list as games that I love to play. But yes, it was. It's amazing how much different it was than say even the SNES and just the overall play style of it. It did a good job, and obviously we go back to soundtracks and things like that. It's amazing, just like it redefined racing games for us as kids, because it wasn't meant to be taken. Obviously people take it seriously, but it's meant to be kind of a fun game where you're throwing, Koopa shells at each other, that sort of stuff. So it wasn't meant to be realistic, and I guess that was where a lot of us, like me and you, probably had more fun with it than. Obviously, I had brother sitting next to me who'd be playing with me, so we would be exchanging insults and other things about how much we were going to beat each other's butts in the game. But it was always really fun just to have, like, I guess that was one of the things where you got as brothers, we had obviously had something where we could kind of fight each other in not literally, we did that plenty, but where you could have more fun just kind of goofing off in terms of a racing game.
Yeah, and the other thing too about that game is it still holds its value today. That was a popular game to play in college. It was very easy to make a drinking game out of it. So like what we would do is you'd have 2 beers per racetrack that you go to, and you had to pull your cart off to the side of the road, then chug your beer, and then get going again. But you'd have to do that again before you completed the track with another beer. It was the not drinking and driving game. You had to pull over to the shoulder to drink your beer.
Oh my goodness. You had to refuel.
Yeah. But the fact that, like I didn't go to college, but I went to like college parties. I didn't go to college.
I was at college, but I didn't go to college.
Yeah. And it, for a group of, 18 to 25-year-old people playing a game that was released so long ago, you know what I mean? Like that kind of says something right there in itself, at least for me.
Yeah. The game was at least 10 years old when we graduated high school. About 10. Yeah. We graduated like 07-ish. So it was 11 years old. So you were when you were going to college, it was anywhere between, that time period. So anywhere between 10 and 15 years old. So that's kind of amazing that, like you said, it stood the test of time as something that people wanted to play. Granted, it was for a drinking game and had to refuel and stuff like that. But yeah, that it stood the test of time so long.
We'll move on to GoldenEye here. That was the pinnacle of all shooters, man. That's
still.
Yeah, what we have today is based on GoldenEye pretty much. So Call of Duty
changed the game.
Call of Duty, you need to thank GoldenEye.
Yeah. Man, I tell you, I think this might be when I think back, this is probably one of the top 3 games I played ever, like in terms of my lifetime. I don't remember the storyline that much because we just played a lot of, obviously, like I said, I've said this a million times. With my brother, we had to play split screen. So I just remember having the Game Shark and or cheats in general, and you could like turn the bullets to paintball. So so we used to try to write our names in the paintball before it disappeared and stuff like that. Like, man, we had so much. Like, you would just make up games that weren't relevant to the game itself, just to have fun with the game. And like I said, running around with paintballs and shooting and killing people with paintballs was always pretty funny. Because you got to think at this time period, I don't know if paintballing had kind of gotten like, I guess it was probably getting there in the early 2000s. But yeah, I remember or like getting the golden gun, and it was like a one-shot kill no matter where you hit them. There's just so many cool things about this game that, like you said, it changed the world. First-person shooter. Just that alone, it kind of changed the game. I don't think there was a shooting game that I've played more probably than this one, except for maybe like Modern Warfare 2. But this is probably, it's right there. What about you?
Yeah, GoldenEye for me was one of them games I didn't play a lot because at that time I wasn't really big into shooters, but it still captivated me because it was, I don't know how to describe it. It was, just going through hallways and any guy that you see, you just light them up. it wasn't like a shooter like an SNES, because at that time about the only shooters we had was like that game that you told me about, Zombies Ate My Neighbors, and flying games and stuff like airship style games. That was about the extent of shooter games. So for that, and like you said, the blood was a turn on for me. You know, I mean, you're shooting people. I mean, it's still a video game, but you're an agent that's going through and shooting people. You are living out that fantasy.
Yep.
That's about all I had for GoldenEye.
I'll let you pick the next one out of the top 10 that you want to talk about.
Man, I want to talk about them all.
Yeah, I know.
We'll go on to the next one, which is Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Man, I love that game. It is so good, even to this day. It is such a good game. And it's kind of set up like Mario, where you got Hyrule Field, which is in the middle of the map, and then you go into the different levels like the Water Realm and the Earth Realm and that kind of stuff, Fire Realm. The combat is what made that game for me, because it introduced melee combat, plus it introduced ranged combat with the slingshot, the sword, you know, getting the different shields. Like as you age, you know, you start out as young Link and then you go to, you know, adult Link. Like that was such a good segue to the game to like keep my interest. The soundtrack was amazing. The sound of the ocarina tunes, like Eponia's song and Zelda's Lullaby and Song of Storms especially. I mean, man, that Song of Storms to this day is still a super popular soundtrack. Like people love it. And it's still stood the test of time.
Yeah, I'm going to break some hearts here. Zelda wasn't on my radar at this time period. A lot of this is talking about times when it was released and times we'd be playing in the original format, not really talking about maybe playing it previously. So as a kid, obviously it's not a first person, it's a single player game. So it doesn't have or at least, I don't know if it didn't have only single player, but
it was
at that time. So as a kid, it just wasn't something I was allowed to play. So I never had an opportunity to play it, unfortunately, in this time period. I've played it since. Obviously, you're fanboying out. I don't remember a lot of that stuff as well as you did. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and move on to the next one, I don't want to embarrass myself anymore.
Yeah, Super Smash Brothers, you know, that was the fighting game. And I'm sure when Nintendo made this game, they had zero thought about making a competitive fighting game. But here we are, X amount of years later, it is still one of the most popular esports fighting titles that there is, which is crazy.
100%. Like, again, this is another game. I'm going to embarrass myself and say I didn't play that much. But it's amazing that it's, like you said, still played in esports. This game was released in 99, the beginning of, in America, in the middle of 99. So it's one of those things where it's like, we're in 2021 here. So it's like 22 years old. It's old enough to drink, and we're still playing it, you know? I find that to be amazing. Just like, and quite frankly, the cool thing that they did with Super Smash Brothers was they added in all of their characters and put them all in one game. Like, how freaking cool is that? You know, they were smart enough to say, hey, let's put Star Fox in here. Let's put Zelda in here. Mario, obviously. Kirby, he was in it.
Let me correct you before you get killed in the comments. Okay. They put Link in there, not Zelda.
Link, yes. Yeah, I apologize. Link from Zelda in it. So they did a good job of, and I don't know why I said Zelda. I was trying to come up with people off the top of my head. So I apologize. But
don't try to backpedal.
Yeah, but it was one of those cool things where it definitely introduced a lot of these characters that were theirs to say, hey, listen, what if you did put Kirby up against certain characters from Pokemon or Yoshi? And obviously, it depended on the person, but it was one of those cool things where they did a great job of kind of introducing a lot of those characters to you.
Yeah, because people like me, you know, I was already a Kirby fanboy, and I'm like, well, I'm just going to pick Kirby. I'm going to eat you, and I'm going to shit out your powers. I'm unstoppable, and I can fly.
Yeah, I just, again, it wasn't a game I played a lot, but the concept, you can definitely understand why it stood the test of time for sure. And then they re-released a couple other ones since then, but this is the one people remember the most.
Yeah, and then the next game on our list would be Pokemon Stadium. That game was fun. It wasn't as immersive as like these other games that we're talking about. One cool thing I do remember about Pokemon Stadium is they made an accessory for the 64 called the Transfer Pack, where you could plug your Game Boy game into it, and it would pull your Pokemon that you got from like Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. So you could import those Pokemon into Pokemon Stadium, which was kind of cool. Donkey Kong 64.
I got a couple things I want to talk about in Pokemon Stadium. I apologize. The thing that I actually remember most about Pokemon Stadium, again, I've said this a million times just because I had a brother, was the mini games. Like the sushi go round where you're lick-a-tongue and you're eating all the sushi. and they had other things on there where you were yeah, you weren't supposed to eat, and you would, you basically like it's like similar to Mario Party in that regard. So it's like I think there was like 5 or 6 different games, and or like you had to run, for example, as Rattata on a treadmill. All these cool little mini games that I played a lot with my brother and my cousins and stuff. And I think that really defined the game more so than the actual main part of the game, where you were, like you said, you imported some of your characters. I never had a Game Boy until later in life, so I didn't have the ability to do that. So I kind of got bored of that part of the game pretty early. And the mini games, though, they lasted forever for me. Like, it was one of those things where I probably played that more. I know for sure. I guess there was 9 mini games, so I apologize, but I definitely played that 100% more than I played the actual part of the game. And the other cool thing was it goes up to 4 players, and if you only had 2 players, you still got to play against the computer. So there was always 4 players in there, and that was pretty awesome as well. But yeah, you can go on with Donkey Kong now. I apologize.
Yeah, with Donkey Kong 64, big fan of the Super Nintendo Donkey Kongs. Obviously I wanted to play this game because it was the open, 3D open world style adventure game with Donkey Kong in it. The problem was that Donkey Kong 64 required this thing called an expansion pack for the 64. And basically what it did is it essentially upgraded your RAM so it could run the game, because the game was that big that it needed this extra RAM to actually function. And there was 2 other games that required this expansion pack. The other game was Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, and then the other one was for the Perfect Dark, just running the story mode. Apparently those games were made so big that it had to have this extra RAM just to run, which at the time, is kind of like a bummer. It's like, here you are, you're forced to buy this extra thing that costs, whether it's like $10, $20, $30. It's something you're forced to pay to play this game.
Yeah, and you're forced to try to convince your parents to purchase it. That's it.
Yeah. That was a tough one.
But thankfully, Donkey Kong 64, because of I guess, apparently it's debated, but for the most part, they included the expansion pack with Donkey Kong 64, which helped out a lot of kids like yourself and me, or myself and you, whatever. Helped us get the opportunity to have it without having to purchase it separately.
Yeah, so the next thing that we'll go into is I'm just going to read off a list of some of the other games I've played that were not on the top 10 most popular. Turok, Perfect Dark, Yoshi's Island, WWF WrestleMania, Blast Corps, Wave Race 64, 1080 Snowboarding, Pokemon Snap, Star Wars Shadow of the Empire, Mario Party, Mario Tennis, Hey You Pikachu, Kirby 64, Cruisin' USA, Mario Golf, Paper Mario, and WrestleMania 2000. How about you, Chris? You got any others on that list?
Yeah, 2 that stand out that you didn't mention for me personally would be Mario Party and WCW NWO Revenge. Those 2 games probably... Those 2, GoldenEye and Pokemon Snap, probably were my 3 or top... Well, and Mario 64. Probably my top 5 games that I played on the Nintendo 64. Mario Party was basically a bunch of mini games. That's sort of like, I guess, its calling card and what it was based on. And for me, I just... Again, I'll say it probably every time we talk about video games until I get to be a little bit older, where I was just, I could play games by myself. But the cool thing about it is it lets you play with a bunch of other people at home on one screen.
And the games was like so fun.
Yeah, and it was randomized, so you never knew which one you were going to get. They just allowed you the opportunity well, first of all, you got to pick who you wanted to play, which is really cool. We used to argue over that occasionally. So I just started picking people nobody else wanted to pick, just because then I had to worry about it, because you would race. That's one of the cool things. You used to I remember in other games, not just this one, but you would race to try to hurry up and get to the person you wanted and press the button to lock them in, And I don't remember any of the games actually specifically at all. I just remember it helped you build those, like, I wanted to win. And, you could lose a game here or there and still win the whole thing. And that was what I always thought was really awesome about it. It gave you the ability to kind of just, you always had bragging rights if you won. Like, oh, you want to play again? I just beat your butt. I just kicked your ass. You don't, whatever. That's because you want to do it again, And it was just one of those things that gave you a lot of ability to kind of like enjoy the game and play it with like I said with family and friends all on one console.
Yeah, one of the games that I want to hit on was Hey You Pikachu. It was one of those. Yeah, that one. It was one of them games that came with a microphone on it, and the idea was really cool. The execution was awful because the premise of the game was like you'd say, "Hey, you Pikachu, go over to that leaf or whatever." And the problem is that voice recognition unit that came with it, the microphone, it was just awful. So here I am, like a 8, 9, 10-year-old kid. I am screaming at my controller. My parents probably think I'm mental,
Yeah.
And Pikachu ain't doing what I'm telling him to do. You know what I mean? It's just annoying. And I really wanted to play the game because I was a big Pokemon fan, because Pokemon was hot back then.
Still is, but definitely right then.
Between the cards coming out, the cartoon show mainly, Saturday mornings.
Yep.
The Game Boy games. I mean, God, man, Pokemon was running wild. Like, that was some straight up Hulkamania stuff right there.
Yeah. Literally. One of the game I wanted to kind of harp on a little bit that I played a lot of was WCW versus NWO Revenge. Obviously at this time in 98, well, this was released in 98, but during this time period, I mean, wrestling was as hot as it ever was. And like you just mentioned, Hulkamania in the mid to late 80s, I mean, Hulk Hogan was running wild, and at this time he's still running wild. He's one of the key figures on the other team, for WCW and the NWO. So it's like, it kind of encapsulated all that as a kid. This is part of my fandom as a kid. And I don't, I'm not afraid to admit that I was a huge wrestling fan, still am for the most part.
Well, I mean,
but at the time, yeah, I'm not afraid to admit it. Some people might be, but not me, I really love it. And
we'll probably do another episode that's just wrestling later on down the road, I'm sure.
Yeah, because I mean, it was a big part of my childhood, and like I said, me and my brother, it was one of the things. That was one thing that him and I could do together. We'd wrestle each other, and right or wrong. I mean, I know people, there were kids getting paralyzed and stuff, but we knew the gig, as kids. It's one of the things where it's like I couldn't explain to you that we weren't really hitting each other, but we kind of knew what was going on,
Oh yeah,
and
you always do wrestling moves on the trampoline or in the pool, on the beds and stuff. Putting people in the sharpshooter, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it was just so funny. Like, we used to do wrestling matches for my cousins and stuff. Me and my brother would, and we just like, we'd sell it. Like, it was hard to convince my brother. Like I said, he's 2 years younger than me, and he always wanted to beat me at everything. That was like his thing. To convince him, hey man, we're working here, brother. We're working here. Like, come on. But but this game, it had so much customization. I think that's probably why I loved it so much. And the entrance was so terrible that I loved it. The way that the characters would kind of walk into the ring. It was WWE and all their video games, they always did the side shot. And WCW, a side shot first, or a front shot and then a side shot. But in WCW, it was straight front shot. So they walked like with their arms at their sides, and it would just swing. It was just so funny because they were so like expressionless.
Yeah,
of course it's that time period, of course, the video games and consoles, but they allowed you to make your own characters. And I just remember I'd always create a character, and he'd be like in a full bodysuit, completely covered head to toe. They had so many cool moves that none of the characters used that you could use. And of course, physics weren't real, so you could pick up the giant and like a giant suplex and stuff like that you couldn't really, obviously, you wasn't going to do it as a small guy, but it was one of those things where like that game, at least in that time period, more than any other game, really, in terms of wrestling games, really took on a life of its own for me. And I really enjoyed it. I never really got into the WWF video games aside for one I forgot to mention that was released on the PlayStation, but it was also on the Super Nintendo, was WWE, or was WWF at the time, Arcade, the arcade game. And that one was hilarious because like I remember being, for example, if you were Doink the Clown, he would pull out a giant mallet and hit you in the head with it and like sort of stuff like that. So that was like that one and WWF Royal Rumble were the two like WWF games at the time that I played, but those are predate this one. And at the time, WCW was so hot that basically anything they touched, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent, it was going to be purchased. So that was one of the things where it was bought for me because of that. And it really exceeded expectations for me personally.
Yeah, for me, my wrestling game on 64 was WrestleMania 2000 because once again, growing up, I didn't have cable, so I didn't get the luxury of watching WCW. I was always a WWF guy, and when WrestleMania 2000 come out, the Attitude Era, I'd say the Attitude Era probably started in like 96, maybe a little
Yeah,
later.
97 probably.
But when this game come out, man, it was at the peak of the Attitude Era, and I was submersed into wrestling. The cover art on this game, I mean, it's got the Big Show on it, Mankind, The Rock, Triple H, and The Undertaker on the cover.
Yep.
And then it's got that 2000 in green, and I've always loved the color green, so that right there just sold me. I don't really remember much about playing the game, because it's a sports game, and back in those times, they weren't super, immersive.
In depth.
Yeah. But I do remember playing that game, a good bit. We didn't for me I didn't really start to like the wrestling, like really, really like the wrestling games until Raw versus SmackDown. Yeah.
Yeah, PlayStation 2, yeah. There wasn't really any depth, unfortunately. On these games, it was more about the fighting or the wrestling part of it, not so much any in-depth sort of storylines or building your own show and stuff like that it became now. And even in SmackDown versus Raw, I'm pretty sure they had that where there was some where you would go through like years and would build up characters and stuff like that. So that wasn't really quite there yet. But it did, like you said, I'm sure I played it. Like I said, I've mentioned Blockbuster a lot. There was one near my house, so it was easy for my parents to be like, and that was an easy $5 for them to spend to shut me up for a couple days. You know what I'm saying? Because to rent a video game was like $5. It might have been with tax, it might have been closer to $7. But either way, $7. If you want to take us to a movie that time, and that's only going to last 3 hours, a couple hours. I mean, that was more than that just to take. Because we had, it was me, my brother, and my sister at the time. My brother's 2 years younger than me. My sister's 4 years younger than me. So it's like, how can you shut all the kids up, without having to spend a lot of money? And the easiest thing to do is go to Blockbuster. Like, you could rent the games. I think it's for 5 days, and then the movies you got 7 days. My parents would never take things back on time, so they always got late fees. No matter how many times I tried to get them to switch out video games because they sucked or whatever the situation would be.
The games or your parents? Both
sometimes. Yeah. Okay. But specifically the games. Like if there was a game that you rented that wasn't very good, if you took it back the same day, usually you could convince Blockbuster to let you rent something else, and that would be the thing that we kind of that I would try to do. So I would try to get home really quickly, play the game, see if I liked it. Very much how you try games these days. 5 minutes. If I don't like it, I'm done. That was kind of the thing we would do, and but my parents would never return games on time. That was usually their issue. Was like if it was a video game had 5 days, I think it was, or maybe it was 3 days. I can't remember. And then the movies or whatever you would rent sometimes had a week or 5 days, something to that effect. But they would just bring them all back at the same time, and then complain about the late fees, and they usually would just remove them for them. But yeah, I just remember spending some time with it, but WCW versus NWO still beat it for me personally. Any other games you want to mention specifically from the Nintendo?
Yeah, they should have made a Mario
64.
wrestling game.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. They kind of sort of did with Super Smash Brothers, but it wasn't exactly the same. Yeah, I think that they would have probably did pretty well. I don't know if you could get away with Miss Peach, with Princess Peach being in there, but
yeah, could you imagine Kirby walking down the entrance ramp with the Titantron going behind him, flexing down the ramp? Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a video on YouTube of somebody doing that. I would not doubt that one bit.
Yeah, you gotta love the times we live in now.
Yeah. One game I do want to mention just quickly, Pokemon Snap. I don't know. I don't really get the point of the game. I mean, I get it, but like, I don't know why we played it as much as we did, or at least Pokemon. I did. Yeah, I think that's all what sold us, right? Because like, in general, the game really wasn't anything good. Like, I mean, I'm sure there's someone going to argue with me on that one, but for the most part, I didn't feel like the game really had a lot to it. It was. I mean, you're literally taking pictures of Pokemon. Like, I remember one specifically. I guess it was on the first level where you would like try to get a good picture of Magmar when he's standing like by a lava pit, and like you got to zoom in and like you want to catch him pulling his arms out or something to that effect to get the best quality picture. Yeah, and man, I just remember getting so frustrated.
Angles. You got to get those angles and no blur. You got to make sure the lighting's right. It was teaching people how to be a photographer, Chris.
And I literally didn't care. Like that, that was just not my thing. I was so frustrated. I was like, all right, let's play some GoldenEye. That was like basically what happened. Is like, and it was a one-player game again, so it didn't get the opportunity to do as well as it maybe should have. Another game that I totally forgot about was Yoshi's Story. I had forgotten. I was kind of dicking around while you were talking a little bit, just trying to remember some of these games. And I remember Yoshi's Story because you played as other colored. I don't know if they had their names, but where you were playing as like a blue one or a yellow one or a red one, and have the opportunities to play as different colored Yoshis. I didn't remember that, but that was a game I probably played just as much, if not more, than some of the other ones. It was a fun game. We'll say that. I don't remember the gameplay or anything that well, but I do remember playing it and having a lot of fun doing so.
Yeah, I can say the same about Paper Mario, that style game. I don't think a lot of people played that game, but it was kind of, once again, it was a adventure style Mario game, but all the characters were made out of, sheets of paper. And it was a pretty cool concept, even as a kid, that kind of stuff. And once again, Mario, I mean, any game that has the word Mario on it at that point, I'd play and love like every other kid. Nintendo, they got Mario right, man. They're set for life with that one character. And still to this day, they are just running, just milking it,
Yeah, and I say why not, right? Because they still make good games. Like there's still games coming out that are still quality with Mario in it, and it's basically the same thing. Like that, I think that's the thing I laugh about a little bit. Obviously, they add a little here, a little there, but it's basically the same side scroller that it was in 1985. Like I mean, the graphics have improved, but the basic premise, like you said with the PlayStation controller, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And that's kind of the thought process I feel like they've taken with Mario. Obviously, they've added things like you say with Paper Mario. They've made other games with that concept, or or you can kind of go a giant Mario or little Mario and that sort of stuff. So they've added certain little elements to it, but the basic concept of the game is exactly the same as it was in 1985. Like it hasn't changed basically at all, and it still works today, and it still sells today. And that's kind of amazing just how it stood the test of time.
Yeah, I mean, even with their sport games, like Mario Golf and Mario Tennis, it's still a sport. So even if, like I didn't like tennis growing up as a kid, but it had Mario in it. So it was still a fun game because the people that make Mario games, they just know how to make captivating games that play nice and have a lot of features in them that makes the game fun and playable to do. Like I said, when I was a kid, I didn't like golf. Golf is for old people. Golf is a boring game. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But now that it's got Mario in it, and I could tee off with Yoshi or something, that was great. It wasn't like the sports games that were kind of coming out at that time era, especially more so on the PlayStation, where they were getting into the realism, like all the Maddens and the Pro Skater and the baseball games and stuff like that. It was more like how I compare like the NFL Blitz games versus the Madden games. Like, yeah, they're both football games, but they're two completely different ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, 100%. What's so funny is I do remember playing like Mario Tennis and Mario Golf, and a lot of it was they did a great job of building those characters to where you cared about them. You had an attachment to Kirby, so anytime you got an opportunity to play with Kirby or play as Kirby, you did it. And a lot of those happened with us. You got attached to Mario, Yoshi, Luigi, those sort of things. Princess Peach. Those are the things that kind of like it forced you to buy some of these games that maybe you wouldn't have given it a chance otherwise. One little thing I wanted to mention about Mario Party that I forgot to mention just because I guess all my calluses have healed up on my palms, but I think Mario Party was the first game that I hurt myself playing a video game. It's back in the day, they used to, I can't remember the game specifically, but there was one where you had to rotate.
The fishing game. You had to reel that mug in quick.
Well, yeah, where you're like rotating with your palm. So you would set the controller down on the table or on something like that, or on your lap.
Yeah,
and
I used my knee.
And you would just spin in circles and circles and circles, and the notches or the raised part of that hard plastic would like dig into your skin, and you'd have a blister like the size of your palm. And my mom would be like, "What the hell have you been doing?" And I'm like, "Oh, just playing video games." And she's like, "What? Huh?"
Yeah, she probably thought she was doing something else.
yeah, I'm sure of it, And she's like, "What do you mean playing video games?" And I had to show her.
Is that what the kids are calling it these days?
Yeah. I had to show her what happens when you play Mario Party, and it's kind of amazing. It's like I told you off air, I probably broke more of those joysticks playing Mario Party than any other game. Well, besides maybe throwing them against the wall, probably more than any other game that was out there. It was just kind of funny that Nintendo did a good job, is they found ways to use all the buttons. Like, that one was kind of unusual for it to be kind of like how you had to hold it, but I guess maybe they did it with some, maybe like you said, a fishing game and certain things in mind where you can kind of, you have a handle of things you can cast and that sort of stuff. Yeah, I just remember that specifically, and I being hurt, like, and then being hurt so badly on like my right hand, I had to try to do it with my left hand, and I was incapable. Like, it's just, it's just crazy to think back on that stuff and how kind of ridiculous it was.
One other thing I want to touch on before we start wrapping this up was the Game Shark for the 64. And what made the Game Shark so unique is, you had Game Genies for the previous generations, but the Game Shark was the first one to where you put the cartridge into the console and then you put the game cartridge on top of the Game Shark. So by the time you're done, you've got like a 6-inch object protruding out of your console. And half the time when you start it up, it was just a task to get the game to load. Now you're putting another device in between the console and the game, and you can imagine the frustration levels there. But it was so cool because, you start the game with the Game Shark plugged in, and then it goes into this new menu. And it's like, pick the things that you want to use. Like you were saying with GoldenEye, like, do you want to shoot paintballs at people? Turn it on. Yep. Do you want God mode? Turn it on. Do you want super speed? Turn it on. And like you were saying with GoldenEye, it gives you an opportunity to play the game, but not play the game. You can make your own game, and this was before all these games come out that had that kind of customability to it, like way before custom games in Warcraft 3 and way before like Minecraft, way before Forge mode and Halo, that kind of style stuff where you could take the base of the game and make a separate game within the game. And to me, that was very fun as a kid playing with all them cheat codes and stuff like that.
Yeah, I just, it's so funny. I mentioned my cousin before about, like, he was the guy that kind of showed me everything. Like, he was like my guy, and or my uncle, I guess. I always call him my cousin because he's not old enough to be an uncle, right? He's only like 3 years older than me, so it's kind of weird. Anyway, I remember coming and visiting his house one time, and he was like, "Hey man, look at this I got," and I'm like, "What the hell is that? What is that?" And he's like, "Oh man, look, watch this. We can get all this cool stuff." And I was like, "What?" Me, I have like this weird moral morality where I was like, "But it's cheating," and he's like, "But you're allowed to do it because you can just buy this," and I'm like, "Okay, whatever." But yeah, it's just. And one of those things where it allowed so many different, like, it gave you all the little cheats and all the little stuff. And like I said, paintball, like that was the one I think I used more. Well, all guns and then paintball. I probably had more fun playing with the paintball than anything, just because, like I said, you could write with your name and stuff. And yeah, it just gave you a whole new layer to each game because as kids, all this is still at a point where we don't have money. We don't have the ability to go out and buy whatever we want to. You had to find ways to reinvent some of these games so you can play them again. I mean, this isn't like games today that have 30, 40, 50 hours of gameplay. A lot of these games, if you play them one time, it might take you 10 or 15 hours if you do it well anyway. You know what I'm saying? Obviously, there's people who speedrun a lot quicker than that these days, but in that time period, I mean, granted, at this point with Nintendo and stuff, they had saves so you could save this stuff, but we're still not talking about a game that takes a massively long amount of time to complete. So as kids, you had to find a way to make these games interesting again. And Game Shark did that. I don't know where my cousin, I don't even know how he got it, but it helped give you more opportunities to do cool things and make some of the games maybe just easier. As a kid, at least I only had so much capacity to be able to learn and change and do things like that. So that helped maybe figure out how to get to the next level or to get to the next point. It did feel like cheating, but I mean, that's kind of the point, right?
Yeah, so what do you think for closing arguments on the 64?
I think that I'm sure that it's well received in a lot of ways, but I think it's still underrated. I mean, it's very top heavy in terms of the games that were successful. I mean, there's still a lot of lists on that bottom half that we probably still enjoy, but it's very top heavy. Like, it doesn't have as many. I'm sure I could pull it up where how many games were released on 64, but I feel like it didn't have the same catalog as, say, a PlayStation or even Sega Saturn from what I've read, but it's still found a way to be successful, and Nintendo continues to be. If I had to pick between the two, because we're only just using PlayStation and Nintendo today, if I had to pick between the two, I would say the 64 probably won for me as a kid. The only one that competed on the PlayStation, there's only maybe 2 games that stand out in my mind as games that were like a part of my childhood, and that was Twisted Metal 3 and Tony Hawk Pro Skater, the first one, more so than the second one, but definitely the first one. But I mean, we could list, just rattling off like the top 5, of the N64 games. You're like, man, I spent so much time playing those games. So if I had to choose, I say 64 over PlayStation in terms of this generation. But what PlayStation did for future generations cannot be understated.
I completely agree. For me, the 64, the console itself wasn't as good as the PlayStation, but like you mentioned, man, the games is what made 64 so amazing for me. And like you said, also just reading through that top 10 list of best-selling games, PlayStation, I played maybe 3 or 4 games on the top 10 list. Nintendo 64, I played every one of them. And it was nice talking about all these games, like all these memories coming back and, lack thereof, because it's been so long. But man, like it really makes me want to just, after we get done with the show here, just go in and boot up the 64 and go play some of these games again, Yeah,
it reminds you of just like, I say innocence when it comes to the SNES, but even with the 64, and to a lesser extent with the PlayStation, there's just so much innocence involved. It's just so pure. And what you as a kid, what you think about video games, like I try to divide my time into certain sections, and like this is towards the end of that generation, in terms of like that being a child, I guess. I was preteen. It was before I was a teenager, before all that stuff. That's when these games were really popular, or these consoles were really popular, and the games that were played on them. But yeah, man, it's one of the things where it's like you forget. I guess you sort of forget. Like I said, I forgot about Yoshi's Story. I forgot that I played that game a lot. It's trying to remember a lot of this stuff. We do some research, but we probably don't do as much as maybe we should. But a lot of it, we want to be able to just kind of free flow and just let it kind of come to us, because that's how best memories are sort of remembered and, figured out. You have any other closing arguments or mentions?
No, I think we've pretty much discussed everything there is, at least in our perspectives, about these two consoles. At least I know I have.
Yes, it's like I said, it's probably the end of our innocence. These last 2 episodes we've done probably encapsulate our childhood. And by childhood, I mean like 10, 11, before preteen, or right around preteen era, and before. The next sort of consoles we'll cover will obviously be completely different, where they'll be sort of in our becoming of age, becoming a teenager and into our teenage years, and those are significantly different in terms of what we'll talk about in the kind of games that will, obviously, as technology advances, they change too, but it's one of those things where it's kind of amazing, the jump that we'll see on the next episode that we'll do talking about like the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and the original Xbox. Just kind of the differences that you'll see, and the growth of us as human beings, from the 64 and then the NES and the original PlayStation, that sort of stuff, from that time period to now, even to this generation, what you'll see kind of like what happens, and like just the growth of video games in general, in addition to kind of the games that are available to be played as well.
If you made it this far, we appreciate it. Thank you for listening to the Chris and Bud Show. This has been our pleasure. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the Chris and Bud Show 1, at Deliberate88, and at BudB88. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.